Hello and welcome back. This is the week 4 lecture. So today we are working on essay 1. I think I told you guys back in the introductory lecture that at the end of each unit we would devote a full week to working on the essay for that unit. So we are reaching the end of Unit 1, our narrative unit, so that means it's time to turn our attention to Essay 1, which is the descriptive narrative. So I want to get you guys started here at the beginning of the week, and then I want to sort of give you a plan to follow for the rest of the week. So step 1, anytime we are getting started on a major essay assignment, we always need to start by going into Canvas and reading the instructions for that assignment. Pretty obvious, I know, but some students will skip that step. Sometimes we don't think it's necessary, we don't think it applies to us, we think we already understand the assignment, and maybe we do. But it never hurts to read the instructions. You need to know all of my requirements, all of the things that I'm asking for. You need to look at the length requirement because that is always clearly stated, and I'll just tell you generally what you need to do for that assignment. So if you go into the week 4 module, you'll see the assignment link for essay 1. Just click on it and you can read those instructions at your leisure. If you have any questions about the instructions, please email me. Do not wait. If you have questions, let's talk as soon as possible. So once you've read the instructions, it's time to get started on the writing process. So we talked about this a little bit before. I kind of went through it quickly. Well, actually, I'm not sure that we really have gone through the writing process in much detail. I may have mentioned it in my introductory lecture. You guys might have watched that Simpsons clip that I posted back at the beginning. I think it was in the week 1 and week 2 modules, which is sort of an example of the writing process and why it matters. But today we are really going to go through all the different stages and parts of the writing process. We can't get to all of these in a single day. You guys are starting with pre-writing here at the beginning of the week, and then we are going to progress through all of the other stages over the course of this week. So there are 3 basic stages to the writing process: pre-writing, drafting, and post-writing. So let's think a little bit about the 2 prefixes that we have here. Pre-writing, that means everything that you do before you start writing. It's all the stuff that comes before the actual writing of the paper. That's what we are starting with today. And then we move on to drafting. That's just another word for writing. But what you are producing when you first start drafting, what you are producing is a rough draft. It's important to remember that. A lot of people end up submitting their rough draft because they think they are finished. But just because you have a completed draft of the essay does not mean that you are ready to submit for a grade, because there's still one more stage of the writing process left to go. And that is, of course, post-writing. Everything that comes after the writing. So once you have that finished draft, you need to spend some time working on it. That's what post-writing means. That's when you revise and edit the draft. In other words, you improve it, you clean up the mistakes, you turn that rough draft into a more polished final draft, and then you submit the final draft. So I really want you guys to try to follow all of these stages of the writing process, not just here with essay 1, but throughout the semester with all of our major essays. So let's start with pre-writing. A few easy ways to get started. That's really what pre-writing is all about. It's about generating ideas and getting started on the essay. If you guys watched that Simpsons clip from the beginning of the semester, you might remember that Lisa the character is trying to write a book, and she thinks that she can just sit down at her computer and churn it out, in a couple of hours, and then she'll be done. And that just makes me and other English teachers laugh, because we know that's how a lot of students look at their work. Obviously, you guys aren't writing books, but you kind of take that same approach, at least sometimes. I'm not accusing anyone. I don't want anyone to feel bad, but if we think back to high school, if we think back to previous classes, we can probably relate to what Lisa is going through, because she sits down in front of a blank computer screen. So if those of you who use Microsoft Word or some other kind of word processor, perhaps you've experienced this. You sit down and you have that blank screen in front of you. All you can see is that blinding white blank page. And that can be very daunting, because you are literally starting from scratch. And that's hard. That's even hard for professional writers. I really want you guys to avoid that common experience. Don't sit down and just try to start writing off the top of your head. That's very difficult. That's going to lead to a very difficult drafting experience. And oftentimes students will get frustrated because they don't know what they want to say, and they're trying to write, but they really don't have enough ideas yet. And that's what I want to avoid. So if we can do some good pre-writing, we will never have to confront a blank screen again. Because like I said, pre-writing is all about generating ideas. And it's really just about getting ideas down on paper. So that's what we start with, some very basic idea generation activities. So I've mentioned a few of these in this week's overview. You can start by brainstorming and free writing. A free write, a little bit different than pre-writing. Free writing is part of pre-writing. Don't get confused. They sound similar. But to free write, free as in I am a free man, to free write, there's really no rules. There's no regulations. You just need to sit down and write nonstop for about 10 or 15 minutes. Okay, so obviously we are writing narratives. So you need to be thinking about what kind of narrative you want to tell. What is your story going to be about? It's time to start getting some of those ideas down on paper. So you can think about your plot. You can think about the major narrative events that are going to happen in your story. You can also think about characters. Okay, what kinds of characters are going to populate your story? You can also think about theme, that larger narrative point. What is your story going to be telling us? What is the larger point? What is the larger significance that you're trying to communicate to us? You can write any of that stuff down. You can write down some details about setting. You can also start writing down some things that you might like to describe. Remember last week we talked about descriptive writing. What are you going to be describing in this narrative? What do you want to describe in detail? Which characters? Which places? Which objects? It's time to start getting some of those ideas down on paper. So when you free write, like I said, no rules. You don't have to worry about spelling, punctuation, how it all looks. You're just generating ideas. And whatever you write down, it's only going to be for you. Nobody else has to see that. So you might write for 15 minutes and write down a whole bunch of stuff. You can do this by hand. You can also do this, on a computer. But just write nonstop. Don't be too self-conscious. Don't stop to think, oh, I don't know if that's good. Maybe I shouldn't say that. Just write. Just write and see what you come up with. And at the end of that 15 minutes, go back through what you have. Some of what you have might be good and it's worth keeping. And then other stuff you might throw out. You might decide, no, I'm not going to use that. But that's okay. Even if you just use 25% of what you write down, 15% of what you write down, that's still a start. That's still better than starting from scratch. So you can use bullet points, you can write, in some kind of abbreviated shorthand. You can do whatever you want to get these ideas down on paper. But as you're brainstorming and free writing, also be sure to think about two things that are always very important to consider before you start working on a big essay: audience and purpose. Okay? You don't necessarily have to write a whole lot of stuff about these things, but you need to be thinking about these things. Think about your purpose. What are you trying to accomplish with your narrative? Okay, there are some obvious things that you can immediately check off. Okay, we all want to tell entertaining narratives that will be interesting to our readers. Okay, that's an obvious goal. Another goal is we want to do well. We want to get a good grade on the paper. So those are some obvious goals or objectives. But I want you to go a little bit beyond those and think a little bit more about the narrative itself that you're planning to tell. Yes, you want it to be good. Yes, you want to get an A on it. But again, think about the narrative point. Think about the larger meaning that this narrative is going to express. Also, think about how you want your audience to respond to the narrative. That's why you have to think about the audience as well. How do you want them to feel? How do you want them to think? Okay, what kind of experience do you want your audience to have when they're reading your narrative? Do you want them to be scared? Do you want them to be on the edge of their seat? Do you want them to be happy? Do you want them to laugh? Do you want them to feel some other emotion? Do you want them to learn something? Do you want them to reconsider possibly some previously held notion? Do you want to change people's minds? Do you want to inspire people? What do you want to do? What kind of effect do you want to have on your readers? You really need to think about that. And think a little bit about who your readers are. Okay, obviously I am the most important reader because I'm the one who's assigning a grade to your work. But keep in mind that on future essays, we are going to do some peer review, which means we are going to be exchanging drafts electronically, which can be a little bit difficult, but I want to try that at least once. We might not do it multiple times, but I want to at least try it maybe on essay 2 or essay 3. We probably won't have time to do it on essay 4 because that's due at the very end of the semester. But there's always the chance, there's always the potential that you might have a classmate read your draft. And think about other possible readers. You don't know that they're going to read it, but they might. Maybe friends, family members, a significant other, a coworker. There could be all kinds of potential readers. I'm the one reader that you can count on. You know I'm going to read it, but there's some other people who might read it too, depending on whether or not you want to share. One reason we don't do peer review for the narrative is because narratives can be a little bit personal, so sometimes people don't really want to share with classmates, and I understand that, but like I said, be ready to do some peer review later, either with essay 2 or with essay 3. So eventually you will be reading each other's drafts, so you can include classmates as potential readers. And like I said, you can include anybody else who you could imagine possibly wanting to read your narrative. Just anybody who might be interested, anybody who you trust or like or want to share with. So your audience can actually be quite large. And think about your audience. Think about what they want. What do we expect? What do we want? You're going to have to make some educated guesses. You're going to be speculating a little bit. But again, use information that you have. You know what I want. By reading my instructions, you can be pretty sure that you know what I want. But there can be just some general things that readers want. We want to be entertained. We want to be engaged. Yeah, we want to learn something or feel something. So you have to give us some of what we want if that narrative of yours is going to be successful. So that's part of the early idea generation. Jot down some things about purpose and maybe jot down a little bit about audience, or at least think about some of these things pertaining to purpose and audience. You can also use what we call the traditional journalist's questions, just as a way to start generating some ideas. The 5 classic journalist questions are: what happened? Who was involved? When did it happen? Where did it happen? Why did it happen? And finally, how did it happen? So this is especially useful for a narrative. Remember what we said back in week 2, a lot of news stories, a lot of journalism, is presented to us as narrative because that's how we learn best. That's how we retain information best. So, what we're doing is not totally dissimilar from what a journalist might do. So you can ask those same questions about sort of the stuff that's happening in your narrative. What is happening? What's the major event? Or what's the major source of conflict? You might want to think about that. Okay, who was involved? That gives you a chance to think about characters. Who's in this story? Who's the narrator? Who's the main character? Who are the supporting characters? Okay, you can start thinking about the who. And then when. That helps you think about setting. The when and the where. Those tap into the 2 levels of setting, right? Geographical setting. Where are we in the world? And then time. Like, what time period is it? Are we in the modern day? Are we in the past? Are we in the future? Or some combination? So you can figure that out. And then why did it happen? That might get you started on the narrative point and the larger theme if you're having trouble with that. Okay, why did this event happen? Why did these characters do the things that they did? And why does it matter? What is the larger significance or meaning behind all of that? And then the how, again, that's just going to help you think a little bit more about your plot. How exactly do these events unfold? How exactly are you going to present these events in your narrative? So again, just an easy way to jot down some information, to get some ideas down on paper. And also think about narrative point of view. As you're brainstorming, as you're free writing, think about who is going to tell your story, this narrative. Who's going to tell your narrative? Are you going to use a first person narrative point of view, which means the main character, it might even be you, is telling the story? Or are you going to use a third person narrator, somebody more distant, somebody more separate from the action? That could be an omniscient third-person narrator who's godlike, knows everything, or it could be a more limited third-person narrator who doesn't know everything but still probably knows a lot, but they're not necessarily involved in the action. They're separate from it. They're not necessarily a character, maybe. They're just the person telling the story. So figure that out. Do you want first person? Do you want third person? And then if you choose third person, what kind of third person? Make some choices. Pre-writing is a chance to start making choices. Writing is really a series of choices that you have to make. And pre-writing is a way to get started on that. The next thing to do with pre-writing, once you have some ideas on paper, you can really start thinking more, again, about the thesis. Normally, we'll call it the thesis. Here, we call it the narrative point, right? Your overall point, your overall meaning. I've already mentioned it, but make sure you have something written down in your notes. One important thing to keep in mind is that Essay 1 is going to be different from our other essays in the sense that you don't have to spell out the thesis or the narrative point in your actual essay. Normally, you must state the thesis very clearly, but narratives are more creative, narratives are more flexible, and we know from reading narratives, especially fiction, that oftentimes the author doesn't want to just spell it out for us. They don't want to just tell us the overall meaning of the text. They want us to be able to figure that out for ourselves. So it's totally up to you as the writer. You can spell out the narrative point in your first paragraph. You can announce it, make it really clear, and make it obvious for your readers if you want. But you can also leave it unsaid. And you can just hope that the readers will be able to figure it out based on your plot, based on your characters, based on what happens. They'll be able to see the narrative point. And that's usually how fiction works. Fiction intended for adults. They don't usually spell out that narrative point. They expect the readers to be able to figure it out. So it's up to you. You don't have to express that narrative point in writing in your essay, but you need to write it down in your notes. At the very least, write it down in your notes for yourself, so you know what your narrative point is. So you are clear on what larger meaning or point you're trying to express. Okay? It doesn't have to show up in the essay, in writing, but you need to have it in your mind. And the first step to doing that is to write it down in your notes as part of this pre-writing process. And then once you see it, you know it, you're comfortable with it, you can figure out ways to express it in your essay without spelling it out for us. Okay, but that's totally up to you. Even if it's not going to show up in your final draft, make sure to write your narrative point or your thesis down somewhere in this pre-writing stuff, either underneath your free writing or on the next page, but just have it down so you can look at it, think about it, and work with it. Okay? Once you've done all that, you can move on to really the final part of pre-writing, which is organization. Organization's very important. We need to get organized before we start writing. Again, everything that we do with pre-writing is designed to make the drafting stage easier. We want to be able to sit down and just start writing in a very fluid way. And to do that, we have to get organized first. So that really means two things: outlining and then coming up with a schedule, a work schedule that you can follow. All right? So the outline is very important, and I'm a big believer in outlining. Not everybody feels as strongly about it as I do, but I love outlines. They're not always fun to do, but they will help you so much later on. So it's always going to be the final part of pre-writing for us, is to come up with outlines for our essays. And you'll notice that I have posted a sample outline for Essay 1. I want you guys to look at mine, okay? You don't have to follow it exactly, but I want you to just have an idea of how you need to start thinking about the individual paragraphs in your essay, because that's really what outlining is all about. It's about planning paragraphs. And once we plan each individual paragraph that we intend to write, we have an overall plan for the paper. And that's really what we want. I always compare an outline to a blueprint for a house. Before you start building a house, you need to have a blueprint to guide you. That's the plan, right? That's what you're trying to achieve. And you have that blueprint handy as you're working. Okay, now you might deviate from it a little bit. You might make a few changes. You might decide to do a few things differently, but you have to start with a plan. Otherwise, the whole thing is going to be very chaotic. So writing a paper is no different. You need to have a plan before you start writing. So look at my outline and notice that I'm kind of basically explaining what I'm going to do at each point in each paragraph. Okay, so I have my introductory paragraph. What do I need to do in that paragraph? Well, I need some kind of an opening hook. I need something to attract the attention of my readers, something interesting, something shocking, something unexpected, something that's going to grab people. You want to grab your readers' attention. So this could be a provocative statement, a question. You could jump right into some action, or you could start establishing a specific scene by describing things and kind of telling us where we are and what's going on. But that's sort of the first step for the intro paragraph. And then we might need to provide some exposition, or that, background information that we often see at the beginning of a plot. I actually think I forgot to mention the plot triangle to you guys when we were going through our key elements of narrative. But we've already covered some of these things. With a traditional plot triangle, we start at the bottom with exposition or background information, stuff that our readers might need to know before they can jump into our plot. So maybe some information about the setting, information about characters, information about stuff that happened previously, like prior to the start of our narrative. That's exposition. That usually comes first. And then we have what's called rising action. And it's during the rising action that the central conflict is going to be introduced. So some kind of problem, some source of tension or drama gets introduced, and then we have rising action, rising action, rising action, and then we reach the peak moment of action. That's like the top of the triangle, the pinnacle. That's the climax. That's when everything comes to a head. The conflict, finally erupts in some way, or it manifests in some way, and it gets, we see a big climactic battle scene, or in some way the tension forces some kind of reckoning. And then we have falling action, which is usually a lot shorter. We're sort of tying up loose ends, and then we reach the final resolution or conclusion. That's at the bottom on the other side of the triangle. So we start with exposition and we end with some kind of resolution. So I've included that in the week 4 module. So that might help us, just because it might help us to organize our narratives. And in that intro paragraph, we might need to provide some exposition to get our readers sort of ready, to get our readers situated for what's to come next. And then the final thing that we can include in the intro paragraph, if we want to, we can include that thesis. We can include the overall narrative point. If we want to just express it in writing, we can do it there at the end of the intro paragraph. But remember, you don't have to. You can leave it implicit. If it's implicit, that means it's kind of unsaid, but you still expect people to know. If it's explicit, that means you just say it. You just announce it so everybody will definitely know. It's up to you. Okay, so that's the intro paragraph. And then we move into the bodies. And again, a narrative is a lot more kind of flexible and open-ended compared to the future essays that we're going to be writing. The future sort of writing styles that we're going to be practicing have much more rigid structures. But with a narrative, it's going to unfold in a lot of different ways, depending on what your subject matter is and what your style is. But you need at least 3 body paragraphs for this essay. And just remember some of the basic things that you need to include. You need to show me a bunch of these basic elements of narrative. You need to show me that you've learned them. Okay, show me that you understand characters and narrative point of view and setting and conflict and all those other things we talked about in week 2. But also, don't forget about description. You need to show me that you've also mastered the key concepts that we discussed about description last week. So I need to see some figurative language. I definitely want to see some imagery. I want to see you using strong, vivid verbs and adjectives. I want you to really paint pictures for us, really make us see whatever is being described. But also, if you're using all sorts of imagery, you'll also be making us smell things, hear things, maybe even taste and touch things, or at least we can imagine that we are. So you're utilizing all of the stuff that we've been learning about through the first 3 weeks of the semester. Okay? And that's how I'm going to be able to measure your mastery. Show me that you can do all of this stuff in your body paragraphs. That's where we have the rising action. That's where we're eventually going to have the climax. And then by the conclusion, the concluding paragraph, that's where you provide the conclusion to the narrative, the resolution. That's when all the loose ends have been tied up, everything's been resolved. We kind of learn what might happen next for the characters, but we've reached the end of our narrative. That can be your concluding paragraph. That's where you wrap everything up. So it's a pretty simple outline. We'll have more complex outlines later in the semester when we're doing more traditional academic writing. But for a narrative, as long as you're telling a good story, you can have a lot of flexibility as far as what you're doing, particularly in your body paragraphs. But look at the intro and conclusion. You have very specific things that you need to be doing in those paragraphs. So make sure you are. The outline that I provide is just sort of a checklist for you, so you can make sure that you're doing the things that I am listing for each paragraph. But ultimately, you need to create an outline of your own. You need to have an original outline where you're planning each paragraph. Okay, I'm going to have an intro paragraph, and I'm going to do A, B, and C in that intro. Then I'm going to have 4 bodies. That would be a nice number for this essay. I know we're used to the traditional 5-paragraph model where we have the intro, 3 bodies, and a conclusion. You can try that. That's the minimum number of paragraphs that you want, but it might be nice to go a little bit beyond it. So you might decide to plan 4 body paragraphs, but figure out what's going to be happening in each paragraph, right? Like in body 1, this is happening. What events of the plot are unfolding? What characters do we meet? What scenes do we have? And then in the second body, we're with different characters perhaps, or we're in a different setting. Different stuff is happening. Maybe that source of conflict is getting more and more intense. Then the third body paragraph, what's happening there? You got to start thinking about that. Plan each body. That's really up to you. The intro and conclusion, I'm telling you what to do in those paragraphs. But create your own outline. That's your blueprint. And then when you're ready to start drafting, you can sit down with the outline beside you. Whoops, this is the outline. Sit down with the outline beside you, or have it pulled up on your computer screen. That way you are not starting from scratch. You have a plan, and you can start to follow that plan as you draft. All right. And the final part of pre-writing, that final part of organizing that I mentioned before, is planning a schedule. You need to have a work schedule for each major essay that we write. So I can't do this for you. I don't know your schedules. I don't know when you guys work. I don't know when you have other classes or what your family obligations might be. So you need to figure out a schedule based on what you know about this week. When are you going to have some time this week to work on this paper? It doesn't really matter if it's Tuesday, Wednesday, but you need to do some drafting before the end of the work week. You really need to have a rough draft finished by Friday. It doesn't mean that you're ready to submit that draft. It just means you have a complete rough draft. So then you can spend the weekend on post-writing. Okay, so figure out, block off some time. When are you going to pre-write? Do you have some time to do pre-writing on Monday or Tuesday? I hope so. And then you can move on to drafting, and then leave a little bit of time, at least on Sunday, to do some post-writing before you submit. Okay, so once you've done all of that, you are finished with pre-writing, and you can move on to the second stage of the writing process, which is, like I said, drafting. That means actually writing the essay. Give yourself at least one full day to really devote to drafting. But see, if you have a good outline, if you've done some good idea generation and you have a good outline beside you, drafting should go pretty quickly. You know what you're doing, you know what you're writing, now it's just a matter of actually writing it. Drafting works best, at least the initial time, if you don't stop a lot. Don't worry too much about grammar and mechanics. I mean, obviously, try to avoid really obvious errors. But don't worry too much about punctuation things, or don't worry if this sentence maybe sounds a little weird or a little awkward. Just keep writing. It's important to get to the end. You know, you want a completed draft, and then you can go back through it and make improvements. But just try to give yourself a nice block of time where you can just write the entire essay in maybe a couple of sittings. You don't have to write the whole thing in a single sitting, but you might want to give yourself 2 or 3 hours over the course of one day to really produce a rough draft. And then later in the week, maybe at the very end of the week, you will move on to the third and final stage of the writing process, and that is post-writing. Everything that you do after you finish that rough draft. And a lot of students skip over post-writing. A lot of students just say, all right, I'm done. I got 3 pages. It's 11:58 on Sunday night, so I'm just going to send it in, and I'll never have to worry about it. That might have worked for you in the past. That might have worked in previous classes, but chances are that rough draft is very rough. It's probably got a lot of mistakes in it. It's probably got a lot of unclear sentences that really need to be addressed. And that's not just true of students. That's true for any writer. You know, I've written some stuff, I've published some stuff over the course of my career, and my rough drafts are often pretty bad. That's just the way it goes. The rough draft just gives you something to work with. It's not a finished product. I've gone back and looked at rough drafts and was frankly kind of shocked at how many mistakes I had. Missing periods, typing in the wrong word. I wanted to say quiet, but instead I typed quite. Misspelling somebody's name, stuff like that. Little things. Things that we often don't notice when we're drafting. Because like I said, the key with drafting is just to write and finish. You don't want to get hung up on little small mistakes. But just because I say that with drafting doesn't mean that I don't want you to eliminate those mistakes later. Okay? It's just there's a time and a place. So once you have that finished draft, you can start post-writing. And post-writing means revising and editing. So let's start with revising. And again, I understand you guys aren't going to be doing this stuff until maybe Saturday or Sunday. So if you want to stop the video here and maybe come back later in the week and listen to this section on post-writing, that's fine. We're not ready to do post-writing yet, but I'm going to go ahead and talk about it so you can use it later in the week. So first, you revise. What is revision? It's kind of an all-purpose term. It just means you are making general improvements to your draft. And that can mean a lot of different things. We typically start with what we call sentence-level revision. That means you're going back through and looking at every sentence. And again, you don't have to necessarily do this for every single sentence, but as you're proofreading, as you're reading back through the draft, you need to notice awkward, weird, or incorrect sentences, or any sentences that are unclear. They're not saying what you want them to say. They don't look right. They don't sound right. Any sentence like that needs to be revised. Now, some of those sentences might actually contain grammatical or mechanical errors that you'll have to fix. But in other cases, there's nothing technically wrong with the sentence, like it's not incorrect, it just sounds weird. It's not clear. You're not expressing what you want to express. So don't feel like you're always correcting mistakes with revision. Sometimes you're just making individual sentences sound better. And that's important. I recommend reading out loud. When you are proofreading your draft, read it out loud. I know that seems strange. If you have roommates or if you live with your family, you might not have a lot of privacy. But if you can find some time alone in a quiet room, read your draft out loud. That's an easy way to identify awkward or just incorrect sentences. You'll be able to hear them. Often it's a lot easier to hear them than it is to notice them if you're just reading silently. So just a little pro tip there. I still do that. I read all my drafts out loud by myself in a room, and if I come across a sentence I don't like, I'll stop and I'll make a note. I'll underline it, I'll make a little notation, and I'll say, revise that sentence. Come back later and fix that sentence. Okay? And after you've done that, you can focus a little bit more on your paragraphs. Start thinking a little bit more about paragraph level revision. Are all the paragraphs working the way you want them to work? Are they in the proper order? Do you have your body paragraphs arranged in a sequence or an order that works, that makes sense for you and for your readers? Are all the paragraphs long enough? Are they developed enough? Remember my rule, and it's a rule that many English teachers enforce. In order for a paragraph to be a paragraph, it must consist of at least 3 complete sentences. So, don't have any paragraphs that are shorter than that, because then they're not really paragraphs. Make sure all the paragraphs are developed and, pretty detailed, but also you don't want any one paragraph to be super long. As a general rule of thumb, we don't want any paragraph to stretch much beyond 1 full page in a double-spaced Word document with 12-size font. So if you find a super long paragraph, there might be a lot of good stuff in there, but maybe you just want to break it into 2 separate paragraphs. Sometimes that's what we do when we revise. Sometimes we rearrange the order of some of our paragraphs. Sometimes we get rid of a paragraph if we just don't like it. It's not working. It's not good. I just want to cut it and replace it with something better. So yes, sometimes revision includes getting rid of stuff that we've already written, and sometimes in other cases, it will also include adding some stuff, making some additions. But it's just general improvements. And once you've spent some time on those, you can move to editing. Editing is a more focused activity. It's really just about finding mistakes and eliminating them, correcting them. So like I said, grammatical and mechanical mistakes, yes, they happen to the best of us, but you need to eliminate as many as possible. You want your final draft to be clean and polished and professional for the most part. And if it is riddled with errors, it is not going to look professional. It is not going to look polished. This is a major problem, as y'all can probably imagine, in English 101. I see a lot of papers that contain good ideas. There's some good thinking going on, but students don't want to revise. They don't want to edit. So they give me these rough drafts that are full of mistakes. They're hard to read. They're unclear. And even though the ideas are good, the essay is not fully successful because the student skipped over post-writing. So leave yourself some time for post-writing. Again, this goes for professionals too. I have to spend time editing my papers because I make mistakes during the drafting stage. Every human does. Don't think that you are exempt. Don't think that you can somehow write flawless drafts, because you cannot. No one can. Now, yes, Some mistakes are going to get through and make it onto the final draft. I'm not expecting perfection. Perfection does not exist in the man-made world, so I'm not expecting that. Okay, if you have a couple of errors, it's not really a big deal. If you have like 10 errors, that's kind of a big deal. If you have 20, 30, 40, now your grade is really in jeopardy, because now my ability to read your paper is somewhat compromised. If your draft is full of errors, full of punctuation errors, spelling errors, by the way, there's no excuse for spelling errors in the modern day, because you can look up any word and figure out how to spell it using, Google. But if there's stuff like that, a bunch of stuff like that in a final draft, I might not even be able to really understand what you're saying. Okay, so revising and editing, really, really important. And when you're editing, you're gonna fix grammatical mistakes like comma splices, run-on sentences, but then they'll just be little things like, typos, extra spaces between paragraphs. Like I said before, trying to type one word but accidentally typing a different word. But Microsoft Word might not catch that because you didn't misspell anything. You just used the wrong word. So only you can catch that. Extra space between words. Like I said, extra space between lines or between paragraphs. We don't want that. The entire document should be double spaced. No exceptions. Okay? So just look for those little things. Give yourself at least an hour or two to both revise and edit. You really need more time than that. My recommendation would be a full day. Give yourself a full day for post writing. But I know that's not always possible with our busy schedules. So at the very least, give yourself an hour on Sunday night before you submit. It will make a world of difference if you give yourself time to revise and edit. And here's my final thought. If you are running out of time, if it is Friday or Saturday and you still don't have a finished draft, forget about post writing, you don't even have a completed rough draft yet, and you think that you're going to run out of time, you feel rushed, you don't think you're going to be able to do a very good job with your time constraints, email me before the due date, before Sunday night at 11:59 p.m. Email me, tell me the situation, and ask me in a nice way for an extension. And if you are a reasonable human, I will grant you an extension. I always do. But I have to get the request before the assignment is due. If you ask me for an extension first thing next Monday morning, the answer will, of course, be no. You can still turn in late work, but it will be counted as late. If I give you an extension, there's no penalty for turning it in a few days late. But just communicate with me. If you need something, if you need extra time, talk to me. Email me. We'll figure something out. All right? And just one more thing. Don't forget about MLA formatting rules. In English, we use MLA. That is our citation style, and it's our style guide. It basically governs how we format our papers. So I have included an example of a properly formatted Word document with just some sample text in there. I want you guys to look at that, okay? Because I'm showing you what your essays need to look like. Double-spaced, 12-size font. I would prefer Times New Roman. You need a heading in the upper left-hand corner of page 1, only on page 1. So look at my heading. Look how I've done it. Your name. You need your name, date, name of class. That's double-spaced too. All right. In the upper right-hand corner, you'll have your page numbers on every page. The heading is only on page 1. Page numbers should be on every page. We're not going to have a works cited page on this essay. We will have them in the future, but we don't have to worry about them right now. But that's also a reminder that there's no outside research allowed for this, okay? No sources, okay? This is your narrative. You don't need any outside sources. If you need to look up a word, if you need to look up some information on some kind of encyclopedia just because you want to include that stuff as part of your plot, that's okay. Okay, you don't necessarily have to cite that. But we are not using sources. Not yet. We will eventually. But we are not doing that on this paper. So everything in this narrative needs to be yours. It needs to be original content. And like I've told you, if you're ripping stuff off from a website, if you're using stuff from another source, I'll be able to tell when I look at your paper in Canvas. So no plagiarism, no cheating, do your own work, follow the stages of the writing process, and you should be in good shape. If you have questions, let me know. Use the material I've posted in the week 4 module. Look at my outline. Look at the sample paper. Okay, look at the overview. I wish you luck. Get in touch with me if you need anything, and I will see you next week as we get started on Unit 2, Analysis.